Hello, welcome to the online edition of international trade, and in this unit 1 we are going to introduce international trade and then build the foundation for future trade theory and policy. My name is Elias. So let me quickly take you through the outline. So in this unit we will look at the classical and the neoclassical models and modern theories of international trade. Specifically, we'll look at an evaluation of the classical market, where we will bring in the start of how the Mechantilists and other schools of thought came up with these trade theories. And then we'll look at the absolute advantage as the basis of trade. Further to that, we'll develop the absolute advantage into the comparative advantage as a basis of trade from the Ricardian's model. And then we'll have the modern theories of trade, where we're going to bring in lots of curves, as well as determining the terms of trade for the nation. Further to that, we will have the production and the consumption gains from trade and the restated modern trade theories. So in this one, we will look at the indifference curves and how they affect trade. And lastly, we will have the determination of equilibrium terms of trade. For further readings, you can look at Dominic Salvatore, chapter 1 to 4, and Karpov, chapter 1 and 2. Okay, so let's begin with the introduction. So international trade comprises mainly of two parts, that is the trade theory and the trade policy. So what we'll look at in the first few units up to unit 3, we will be looking at trade theory. Then unit 4 and these other units which will follow, we'll look at trade policy. So when we are looking at trade theory, we analyze the basis and the gains from trade. We want to know why should nations trade, and if they trade, what are they going to gain from such a trade? If there is no basis for trade, then the theory will tell us that nations will not trade, because each nation will want to protect the interest of its citizens. Therefore, trade would take place if the basis is defined, and therefore we would want to measure the gains from trade for each participating nation. Under trade policy, we examine the reasons for trade and the effects of trade restrictions. Why should nations restrict trade? And if at all they were to restrict nation, restrict trade? Do they have the justification for doing so? Later we will note some of the reasons why nations impose restrictions, one being that they want to protect the domestic production. So we will analyze these in more details. For now, let's set the foundation. So just to note that international trade is a part of international economics. Now, in international economics, we study economic and financial interdependence among nations. So we look at how cross-border activities are happening or are taking place between participating nations. For example, we would want to see how Zambia and South Africa conduct the trade and what is involved, what are some of the financial transactions that take place in such an arrangement. So just to add on that international economics analyzes the flow of goods, services, payments, and monies between a nation and the rest of the world. It also looks at the policies directed at regulating these flows. If the flows of goods and services are not smooth, governments usually intervene to ensure that the nation, its citizens are well protected, domestic activities are well protected. Therefore, this part of international trade will help us understand why should nations impose restrictions, or why should nations participate in free trade agreements. Okay, so international economics also looks at the effect of the flows of these goods, services, payments, and monies on the nation's welfare. So the more reasons why nations engage in trade is first and foremost to improve the welfare of the citizens. So if trade is not leading to an improvement in welfare, then it is not said to be a good direction for the nation to take. Okay, so let's begin our analysis by looking at the evaluation of the classical market, and specifically, let's begin with the mercantilist view. So mercantilism is an economic philosophy brought up by a group consisting of merchants, the bankers, the government officials, and philosophers. These are people who had come up with different ideas, and out of their activities they defined trade and came up with reasons why nations should trade. And out of their analysis, they further gave directions to what a nation should do for it to be able to gain in trade. So their view on trade is that for a nation to become rich, it has to export more than it imports. This means that the nation has to maintain a positive trade balance. Now, what this means is that for you to have a positive trade balance, you need to have, let me draw this for you. So trade balance is equal to the export minus the import. So if you are to maintain a positive trade balance, it means that the export must be more than the imports. If this export part is greater than Z, it means the whole of this part will become positive. Therefore, for a nation to become rich, it has to export more than it imports. Okay, a nation has to accumulate more precious metals such as silver and gold for it to be powerful and wealthy. And with this, it shows that a nation is able to control other parts of the economy and even other nations in terms of the directions of trade, provided it has more precious metals. This means that the more precious metals a nation has, the more vocal or the more powerful it becomes in terms of decision making across the globe. Further, the mercantilists preached economic nationalism, which is the part that nations can only gain at the expense of other nations. This means that if a nation has to accumulate more precious metals, and if a nation has to maintain a positive trade balance, it means it will buy less from other nations but yet export more. As a result of this, it means that the other nation, which is the trading partner to the nation in question here, becomes worse off because it will export less and yet import more. Meaning for one nation, it will have a positive trade balance, but the trading partner will have a negative trade balance. So, in addition to this, or rather in concluding on this, it means that nations can only gain at the expense of the other nations. And further, to promote a favorable trade balance, the mercantilists advocated for, number one, that government should impose strict controls on all economic activities. This means that government should not allow nations, international trade activities to just happen behind their back. The government should ensure that there are stringent measures which are put in place to ensure that the nation does not import more, but however restrict isn't the movement of commodities from its producing plants to the other nations. In addition to that, The mercantilists also advocated for tariffs, quotas, and other commercial policies in order to minimize imports so that the nation can protect its trade position. Now, this means that if you have more tariffs or more quota imposed, you want to ensure that a lot of commodities are going out and less are coming in. So we need to take note here again that when we are looking at these tariffs, the key part was they proposed for import tariffs, mainly that the import tariffs should be high, and for the export tariffs it can be free, or you can impose some tariffs, but it should be a minimal amount. Okay, so let's look at the importance of the mercantilist view. Why should we talk about mercantilism? Number one is that for ideas of other classical economists to be considered perfect or to be well understood, they have to be looked at as a reaction to what the mercantilists brought forward. That is, if we are to look at why other economists will propose government to allow free trade, we need to look at it as a critique to the point which the mercantilist says we should have stringent measures to ensure we restrict trade. And secondly, we will note that even today, nations with high unemployment levels seek to restrict imports in order to stimulate domestic production and therefore employment. What this will mean is that if nations restrict imports and encourage domestic production, local producers will be able to employ citizens in the nation, and therefore unemployment levels will decline. This is also something that we should understand, that the mercantilist view, even if it's an odd thing, we still live with it today. What are some of the arguments then against the mercantilist view on trade? So in looking at the arguments, we first start with one that was brought by David Hume, which is the price specie flow mechanism. According to this, a favorable trade balance is possible only in the short run, because over time it would automatically be eliminated. How this was explained is that first, a continuous accumulation of precious metals will lead to an increase in the amount of money, and this will lead to inflation. Now, you know that if you have a lot of money circulating in the economy, yet productivity is low, then we will have inflation, because there will be a lot of activities taking place and a lot of consumption needed. So in order for us to scramble for the few commodities that we have, we need to allow prices to go up. Therefore, if we continue accumulating precious metals, then we will end up with inflation. And as such, domestic products will be expensive and it will become cheaper to import. Now, if importing becomes cheaper, this will lead to a deficit in the long run. So in as much as the nation has tried to maintain a positive trade balance, but because of inflation, that trade balance will be weakened. And in the end, we will have a situation where nations will see local people in the nation will see local products to be more expensive. And then foreign products, which are substitutes to the ones they are producing locally, will become cheaper. And as such, they will resort to importing as opposed to buying local products. Now, if a lot of commodities are being imported, it means that the domestic market will have a lot of those commodities of which it would want to export out. But however, due to the fact that locals are not buying as much, we are likely to have a deficit in the long run. Therefore, this still disagrees with what the mercantilists put up, that a nation will always maintain a positive trade balance. The second argument comes from the static view of the world economy. The view that the world's wealth was fixed meant that one nation could only gain at the expense of the other nation. However, There were a lot of critiques to this view, and one of them is Adam Smith, who challenged it and postulated that the world's wealth is not fixed. In his view, international trade permits nations to take advantage of specialization and the division of labor that increases the general level of productivity within a nation, and thus output will also grow. With this view, Adam Smith postulated that we need to have a free trade. The nations should be open and be allowed to trade freely. And with that, all you need to do is allow nations to specialize in commodities, in producing commodities where they are efficient, and therefore there should be division of labor. If this happens, nations can freely trade, and both nations would gain and acquire wealth. Okay, so that is it about the Mechantilists. Let's turn our focus to looking at absolute advantage. Before we go deep in absolute advantage, let's first bring out the assumptions. Number one is that we will only assume two nations, A and B, and two commodities, X and Y. The reason we are doing this is we want to keep our analysis simple, and later on or in your free time, you can look at the same assumption, but bring in more nations and more commodities. And if you visit Salvatore, you will find this analysis at in the appendix section, where we are looking at more countries and more commodities. The second assumption is the labor theory of value, where we are assuming that labor is the only factor of production that is brought into the production process. Then we also assume international specialization of labor, that nations will specialize in producing certain commodities and their labor will be channeled to such production. And finally, we will assume that the cost or price of a good depends exclusively on the amount of labor required to produce it. Therefore, it means that the factor prices are likely to influence the commodity price. Okay, so let's begin with the full analysis of what Adam Smith brought in this international trade theory. So, in his presentation of Wealth of Nations, which was written in 1976, Adam Smith postulated that when one nation is more efficient than the other nation in the production of one commodity, but it is less efficient than the other nation in producing a second commodity, then both nations can gain by each specializing in the production of the commodity of its absolute advantage. And if this happens, given that nations have specialized in producing commodities where they are efficient, then nations can exchange part of the output with the other nations for a commodity of its absolute disadvantage. Okay, so here we have a disadvantage. A commodity of its absolute disadvantage. That is, given two nations who have agreed to trade, nation A and nation B, if nation A is more efficient in producing commodity X, while nation B is more efficient in producing commodity Y, then it means that the two nations can specialize in producing the commodities in which they are more efficient and leave that commodity where they are less efficient for the other nation to produce. After the production has taken place, because the nation now will produce huge quantities, they can freely trade with each other by exchanging part of the output. And by so doing, both nations will gain from such trading. Let's look at the illustration of this part of trade. Let's assume first we have nation 1 and we also have nation 2. And here we assume that nation 1 has an absolute advantage in producing commodity X, while nation 2 has an absolute advantage in producing commodity Y. This means that for nation 1 has an absolute disadvantage in the production of commodity Y, while nation 2 has an absolute disadvantage in the production of commodity X. And given that nation 1 is efficient in X, while nation 2 is efficient in producing Y, it means that nation 1 will have to specialize in the production of commodity X, while nation 2 will have to specialize in the production of commodity Y. After the output has been produced, then the two nations can freely trade by exchanging part of the outputs that they have with the other nation for the commodity of its absolute disadvantage. And according to Adam Smith, the result of such trading is that resources will be fully utilized, or resources will be efficiently used, and that output of both nations will increase. Okay, let's look further, look into absolute advantage in more details according to Adam Smith. So Adam Smith advocated for the policy of laissez-faire and stated that nations would gain if there is free trade. In other words, according to Adam Smith, he advised that the government should have as little interference as possible with the flow of commodities between nations. And he further stated that it will even be better if the government can just remove itself from interfering with the operation of trade, that is, with the movement of goods across the border. Free trade produces two major results. Number one is that he observed that world resources will be utilized because nations will basically specialize in producing commodities where they are efficient, and they will have it at the back of their minds that they will freely trade with the other nation and therefore gain from such trading. And secondly, world welfare will be maximized. So because nations now have freely traded, and therefore the volumes of trade have improved, and nations have abundant items, they tend to have improved welfare. Maybe just as an illustration, let's look at an example. Consider two nations, A and B, and two commodities, X and Y, given in the table below. So here we see that nation A is producing 6 units per hour of commodity X and 4 units of Y per hour 4 units per hour of commodity Y. For nation 2 is producing 1 unit per hour of X, which is nation B, so 1 unit of X per hour and 5 units of Y per hour. Clearly, you will see that both nations are endowed with the same resource and they are using an hour. So each nation has 1 hour to produce the given items. If you look at commodity X, you will see that for commodity X in an hour, nation 1 will produce 6, while nation B will produce 1. This means that nation A, therefore, is more efficient in producing commodity X than nation B, because given 1 hour, nation A can produce 6 units, while nation B can produce 1. If we go to the production of commodity Y, we see that for nation A, given an hour, nation A will produce 4 units of commodity Y, while nation B will produce 5 units of commodity Y. And we see that here, nation B is more efficient in producing commodity Y than nation A. So now, given this information then, let's suppose that each nation specializes in the production of a commodity of its absolute advantage and trade with each other for the commodity of its absolute disadvantage. And if we suppose further that nation A exchanges 6 units of a commodity X for 6 units of Y with nation B, the question is, what are the gains from specialization for each nation? Now, if you are looking at that, we can clearly, maybe let's go back and see the table again. So you will see that if nation A was to specialize in the production of commodity X, it means that we will get the 1 hour which was supposed to be used for producing commodity Y and channel it to producing commodity X. Meaning that for commodity X, we are going to produce 12 units in nation A. And then we'll produce 0 of commodity Y. If we go to nation B, we see that nation B can produce 1 unit of X in 1 hour. And now the question says, if nation A decides to exchange 6 units of X for 6 units of Y, it means that nation 2 then will now have 6 units of commodity X. Now, given that this 1 hour, which was supposed to be used here, will not be used because nation B will specialize in producing Y, it means that the whole 6 hours which nation B needed to produce the 6 units of X will be channeled to the production of commodity Y, which means that we will have now 0 units of X produced, and then 30 units of Y produced. This is because the whole 6 hours which nation B is withdrawing from the production of commodity X is channeled to the production of commodity Y because of specialization. And if nation A is to exchange 6 units of X, meaning if we subtract 6, which will go to nation B, so we put plus 6 here, we will see that nation A will remain with 6 units of commodity X. And nation B will have 6 units of commodity Y, of commodity X. Clearly, if we see below here, nation A is getting 6 units of Y, so meaning we are adding 6 here. So which means that nation A then will have 6 units of commodity commodity Y, and here we subtract 6, meaning nation B will have 24 units of commodity X. And given this, then we can simply look at the analysis that nation A gains 2 units of Y, since previously it could only produce 4 units. Now, given that now it is consuming 6 units because it has exchanged its 6x to gain 6y, and now the extra 2 becomes the gain for nation A. In other words, nation A will save half an hour of labor. For nation B will gain 24 units of Y, and this is because nation B requires 6 hours to produce 6 units of X. And transferring these hours to the production of commodity of its absolute advantage, which is commodity Y, it means nation B produces 30 units of Y. And since 6 is traded with nation A, the remaining 24 units of Y is the gains from specialization for nation B. So in conclusion, nation A will gain 2 units of Y, while nation B will gain 24 units of Y, and therefore the total gains from specialization is 26. So with this, I conclude that for nations, according to the Mechantilists, for nations to gain and be able to trade well, they should export more than they import, and therefore they need to acquire precious metals. Whereas from the side of the absolute advantage, there is supposed to be free trade for nations to gain. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, please send an email to muauelias@gmail.com. See you in the next video.